We don't want to couch these diets in dogmatic, overzealous, fear-mongering terms. A, because most dietary changes don't require 100% adherence to yield a benefit. And B, because that can really lead to unnecessary fear in people, how they are perceiving food.
Welcome to this week's Wellness Wednesday. And for this week's episode, we have an excerpt from my interview with Dr. Michael Ruscio as part of the Fatigue Super Conference. One of the things I really appreciate about Dr. Ruscio's approach is, despite the fact he has a very deep understanding of the role of gut health and digestion in supporting optimum health and well-being, he also takes a very measured approach. And that's really what we're opening up in this excerpt from the interview. So if you're somebody who's ended up in extremes and overwhelm and perfectionist patterns trying to always get it right around food, I think this is going to be a really important clip. So here is Dr. Michael Ruscio. And I think that's a good kind of opening to explore a bit more about just kind of why the gut is so important in fatigue, or put another way, why the gut is so important in energy and having optimum health and well-being.
Sure. Well, the gut is so important for a couple of reasons. One, it's really the most impactful immune barrier you have in your entire body. And so we know that 90% of our the majority of our immune cells are contained in the small intestine. So the largest density of immune cells you see anywhere in the entire body is actually located in your small intestine. Now, why is that relevant? Well, arguably, your immune system is the chief source of inflammation in your body, because the immune system uses inflammation as its instrument of cleaning up and attacking things that it doesn't want there. So if you think of your immune cells like little police officers, their guns would be these guns that shoot inflammation at the stuff we don't want, and that's how they attack. So the problem is, if the immune system is overzealous, or there's this chronic battle or leaky permeability issue in the gut, the immune system will constantly be responding with inflammation. And those inflammatory proteins can go systemic and cause problems like joint pain and brain fog and whatever else. So that's one fundamental reason. Also, of course, our calorie and nutrient absorption occurs in the gut. So there's this kind of double negative where if the gut isn't functioning properly, you have this cascade of inflammation, and you also can start malabsorbing the nutrients that you need to rebuild and replenish your body. So this is two of the major reasons why the gut is such a fundamental factor in people's health. And if that's not right, it's very hard for other therapies to work, because that is really the foundation upon which we might want to stack other therapies.
One of the statistics that really landed for me when I was reading your book is that the small intestine is responsible for 90% of caloric absorption. And I think people often think of the digestive system as being it has a series of steps. I'd never quite realized just how crucial the small intestine is in effectively the first step in energy production.
Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons why that piece about the small intestine is relevant is because many of the gut recommendations circulating on the internet are more focused around large intestine health. And so if you're putting most of your recommendations upon the less important area of your digestion, it's no surprise some people struggle with improving their gut health, because the majority of the recommendations are focused on the smallest part of, or a smaller part of your gut. And how this plays out is some simple dietary recommendations that are supposed to feed bacteria in the gut, just as one example. They look good on paper for the large intestine, but they oftentimes are counterproductive for the small intestine. And this can frustrate people because they change their diet and they may actually feel worse. They may actually feel more bloated or more fatigued. And it may be because they think they're doing their system a favor by trying to eat to improve their large intestine health. But that recommendation is actually at odds with what the small intestine actually needs.
So maybe to go a bit deeper into this, say a bit more about what triggers inflammation in the guts. Like what's the primary source of inflammation, which then of course has this cascade impact in terms of leaky gut and everything else that then kind of comes from that?
Well, this can get a little bit complicated, but what I try to provide people is a somewhat linear hierarchy of steps to work through, where instead of having this whole litany of potential causes of inflammation and leaving the user up to figure out how to navigate through these, we provide a linear step-by-step process, starting with the most commonly problematic factors. And that's, of course, where you want to start, and ending with the more esoteric or more nuanced factors. And that in and of itself can be a hugely cathartic change for people. Because what I found, and this is one of the sad things about just the nature of the internet, is the new and novel stuff is what gets more attention on the internet. Those things rise higher in Google searches, higher in podcast feeds. And so you're more likely as a healthcare consumer to come across the new and nuanced that are really the end of the hierarchy. And that is one reason why so many people flounder. They spend the majority of their time trying to piece together different nuanced therapies while missing the really preliminary frontline therapies that should be situated first. And one of those, of course, is your diet. That's really, your diet and your lifestyle are the two areas that have to be accounted for first. Now, the challenge is that no one diet is going to work well for everyone. There's a few contending diets that someone should trial. And by going through a few week trial period of dietary experimentation, they can find what diet works best for them. But another challenge that the healthcare consumer is confronted with is you get oftentimes these dogmatic views on diet. Everyone should be on low carb, or too much carbs are too much fat. If you go low carb, fat is bad for you. Don't eat fat. Go high carb. Go vegetarian, go carnivore, and people are just like, oh my God, how do I navigate these? Well, the truth is, for most diets, there's some evidence to support them. So it's not an issue of this is the best diet, but rather here are the few diets that are the most well supported, and here's how we can have you try one, reevaluate after a couple weeks. If you're feeling a lot better, great. That tells you you're on the right track. If you're not feeling a lot better, then change to a different diet. And there's really two, I think, initial diets that people can start with. You have an elimination diet, meaning eliminating common inflammatory foods. And this is oftentimes well depicted by the paleo diet. The paleo diet isn't the only diet to use there, but that's just one kind of in a box diet that will give you an elimination of many inflammatory foods. And that's one. And the other good contender is a lower FODMAP diet. And this is different, where it's more so focused on limiting foods that encourage bacterial growth. And if you're someone who has an excess of bacteria in, let's say, your small intestine, if you're eating a diet that encourages bacterial growth and you already have a lot of bacteria, obviously that can be problematic. So the low FODMAP diet limits foods that feed bacteria, and thus can kind of starve these bacteria and help get them into a better balance. So those are really two kind of key diets that people can start with, and it only really requires a couple weeks on a trial of each one of these to at least be able to say, yes, I'm feeling better and I'm going to continue with this, or no, I feel no different or maybe even worse, so I'm going to change my dietary approach completely.
And of course, one of the challenges can be that when people start to make dietary changes by themselves and they start to get kind of fear-mongered by lots of different conflicting ideas, one of the things that I've seen happen, and I remember I had chronic fatigue in the mid to late 90s, and back then it was anti-candida diets was kind of the rage back in those days. That what I noticed was happening to me and happened to others is each week you kind of discover a new food that you should be avoiding. So you end up with less and less kind of foods. So I think what you're saying is really interesting, that it's not just going on diets and following them kind of blindly, endlessly forever, that actually it's tracking symptoms. Like, does this actually have a positive impact in terms of how I'm feeling? And there should be something that's fairly quick, right, in terms of that feedback loop.
To initially assess if the diet's working for you, yes, usually only 2 to 3 weeks is enough time to tell if the diet's helping. Now, it's not to say that you'll see all of your improvement in 2 to 3 weeks, but you'll at least be able to make that initial benchmark evaluation of yes, it's helping, or no, it's not helping. And you'll also make another, I think, very important point, which is we don't want to couch these diets in dogmatic, overzealous, fear-mongering terms. A, because most dietary changes don't require 100% adherence to yield a benefit, and B, because that can really lead to unnecessary fear. in people how they are perceiving food. And that in of itself, there have been more patients than I'd like to admit that a huge improvement for them was realized after we let them know, hey, it's okay if you're not perfect. I expect you to make a few errors with your diet or be at a work function or a family event and not be able to fully follow the diet. That's okay. As long as you're compliant most of the time, then you're going to be just fine. And that alleviated a huge burden of stress. And there have, again, been more patients than I'd like to admit who saw very substantial improvements in how they were feeling just by coming to terms with they don't have to staunchly follow the boundaries of a given diet.
I hope you enjoyed that clip. You can see the full interview with Dr. Ruscio as part of the Fatigue Super Conference. You can still buy access to the digital recordings at fatiguesuperconference.com. Tomorrow on Everyday Alex, I'm going to be talking about discipline, something that has been a theme in different places in some of the Therapeutic Tuesdays, has been cultivating self-care and self-love. And I think one of the things people wonder about is how does that meet discipline? How does that meet following through with things that seem difficult and challenging? And I have quite a lot to say about this. I'm going to try and condense it into tomorrow's video, which is Thoughtful Thursday on Everyday Alex. Look forward to talking with you then.